Hi, I'm Gary and this is episode 239 of EV Musings, a podcast about renewables, electric vehicles, and things that are interesting to electric vehicle owners. On the show today, we'll be looking at what the government can do to help EV drivers. This season of the podcast is sponsored by Zapmap, the free-to-download app that helps EV drivers search, plan, and pay for their charging. Before we start, I wanted to remind you that next week is the season-ending roundtable episode. Our guests will be Jess Shanahan from Jet Social, Shane Rees from Chargy, and Alec Peachy from Transport and Energy. We've got some great topics in store, but I don't want to spoil anything for you about them, so you'll have to wait until then to find out what they are. Now, our main topic of discussion today is, well, there's no single main topic of discussion. I've had quite a few guests on the show this season. As each guest comes on, we do the interview for the podcast. And when that's done, I've also asked every guest the same question. And that question is, with the recent change in government, what can the new government do to facilitate the uptake of electric vehicles in the UK? As you can imagine, there have been quite a number of suggestions from the various guests. And what I want to do today is to take a look at some of those suggestions, group them together, and see what sort of common elements and suggestions we can find, and play you a couple of the answers that I got. Now, what I also want to do is to pass some of these suggestions through my guest for this episode, who's Matt Adams.
I'm Matt Adams. I'm the Transport Policy Manager at the Association for Renewable Energy and Clean Technology, or REA for short. As Transport Policy Manager, I look after our sort of 110 strong members who work with us to accelerate the transition to electric vehicles and accelerate charge point rollout.
Matt's very closely involved with the government and what they're doing with the energy transformation, renewables and decarbonisation. He and I went earlier this year to the Houses of Parliament for the EVA England manifesto launch. I wandered around like a tourist, looking at the various statues, photos and key chambers, etc. And Matt knew everyone there and was very comfortable in that environment. So we're in good hands with Matt. So let's look at what we discussed. Now, fully charged Jack Scarlett and Hanson Chung from the Tyre Collective both focused on the infrastructure. Here's what Hanson had to say.
I think the biggest thing the government needs to do is to build the infrastructure needed to actually support the uptake of EVs. More reliable kind of charge points is one of my biggest things. Within London, it's very it's pretty good. But once you go outside of the UK, I've not had the best of luck. So I think getting that infrastructure to be so reliable, just like going to the petrol station, would definitely ensure higher uptake on EVs.
Jack had a slightly different focus on this.
Well, we need to continue churning out the chargers, although anecdotally, at least where I live, I actually think that's moving at a pretty good rate at the moment. I think the motorway service station charging network is really flying at this point. It's gotten to the point where, generally speaking, when I need to charge on a long drive, I'm not even checking. I'm just pulling into that service station, admittedly with a good chunk of my battery remaining, just in case there aren't many chargers or they're all really busy, and then I'll just go to the next service station. So I think the charge network is coming along nicely. I want to see way more slow chargers in residential areas mounted in lampposts. I want to see way more destination charging. I want to see way more encouragement of chargers being installed in supermarket car parks, new builds, all that stuff. But the big one is simply incentivizing the purchase of them. Because, we got rid of our EV incentive way too early, and they weren't even that good when we had them. So when you go to Norway and you talk to an EV driver and you ask them, why do you drive electric? They don't say, because I'm passionate about climate change. They don't say because of the tailpipe emissions. I mean, I'm sure those things play on their minds. But generally speaking, when we asked a lot of people about this in Oslo, most of them just said it was cheaper to buy. It was cheaper to buy. So I bought it, and now I really love it because it's great. We just have to make it make sense for people to go electric, financially speaking. And you and I both know that once people go electric, they don't really look back, generally speaking, right? So what could that look like? Well, it could look like slashing purchase tax on new EVs and sticking a bunch of it on pollutive ICE cars. What they do in Norway, again, is the more polluted the vehicle is, the higher the tax. So if you want a Porsche Panamera Turbo, you can have one, but you're going to pay 200%. You're going to pay the sticker price and that price again in tax. And hey, and then you get to drive around saying, look how rich I am. Look how much I've gone out of my way to pollute with my V8, and good for you. But then that makes it, that frees up funds for everyone else.
So let's see what Matt has to say about that.
So I think the government has sort of three clear roles, really. I mean, one is to create a supportive policy and regulatory environment. And, so that's number one. And that's something, we've seen government make a lot of progress on over the last couple of years. I mean, it was only last year that we ourselves launched a report on barriers to charging infrastructure that we called Charging Forward to 2030. And within that, we covered loads of ground and looked at things like street work licensing, Section 50s, permitted development rights, all of that sort of stuff. And then it got picked up within about 6 months by government, and we're part of the consultations and the government plans. So I think government are making a lot of progress. I would say that a lot of those consultations that came out, so like particularly the street works licensing and permitted development rights, they came out back in, I think it was January this year, and we've still not seen a response to any of those consultations. Now, I mean, a year's response isn't necessarily unusual, but given the importance to the sector, it would be good to get those out the door as soon as possible next year. We're kind of hoping they come out in Q1. I think, working with industry more. I think the government do a great job of that already in some ways. I mean, we have it's pretty much open door policy in some ways. We get regular calls and catch ups with government, and we ourselves then go away and talk to our members and talk about what their particular problems are. So, at Labour conference, for example, we produced a short leaflet for a few select Labour politicians. So the chair of the Transport Select Committee, Ruth Cadbury, and Bill Esterson, the chair of the ESNES Select Committee, and a few other MPs. And it was really interesting actually being able to talk about the particular problems just for on-street charging. And one of those is that at the moment, on-street charge point operators but basically aren't allowed to choose where they put their charge points. It actually goes to the local authority, who will basically say, we want you to install charge points here, despite the fact you've done research that says the utilization will be much better over there. And so one thing we're desperate to try and change is that, and to actually basically at the moment local authorities are collecting lots of data from lots of CPOs and are trying to work out the best places to put it from a completely neutral perspective. But also local authorities have the difficult challenge of also supplying charging infrastructure to places where there isn't necessarily going to be big uptake or utilization, and they need to have a good geographical spread. And so I think, it's going to be a very hard thing to do, but lots of countries in Europe have this where, charge point operators can pick and choose sites. And I think, going forwards, it'd be great if we can move towards that. And that's something government are very aware of and working with us on, among others, I'm sure. But I think, certainly creating that policy and regulatory environment is definitely step one. Step two is definitely, how do we communicate charge point rollout to the public? How do we communicate EVs to the public? That's got to be really important as well. We were part of a comms roundtable recently that we're working with government and other industry stakeholders to say, how do we actually communicate the progress we've made so far? I mean, 73,000 public charge points, hundreds of thousands of domestic and workplace charge points, probably nearly 1 million. I mean, with all that in mind, you're nearly 1-to-1 for EVs to charge points. So how do we get to a point where actually the public are more aware of this? But even then, I was at a round table in Parliament this week, and what was brought up is, that's all very well saying that, but it's not very easy to understand what 73,000 charge points means, public charge points means. And also, some people would say they're not geographically well spread out either. I think something like 30 or 40% of public charge points are in London, and the rest gradually spreads out. So how do we improve that too? I think they're going to be really important. And I know in the past you've spoken about the need to just get the charge points in the ground as quickly as possible everywhere. And absolutely, we need to do that. And hopefully the government will be able to work with us on that. I mean, I have to say some areas are going to be slower than others. We had a very interesting consultation response come out this year that was, in REA terms, 3 transport policy managers ago that we responded to that consultation, which is about 4 or 5 years ago. And that particular consultation was on way leaves. So, the ability to put wiring over private land. And and get permission to do so. Yeah, I think some areas take a lot longer because it covers lots of different government departments and all the rest of it. But yeah, I think going forwards, what would be really good for government to do is create more, either a completely new office for net zero that covers a lot of these things and avoids having to talk between DESNZ, Department for Levelling Up, or Housing and Communities, or whatever they're called now, and OZ and DFT, and actually just have one department that does all of it, and you don't have to tread across different departments, which take much longer, and all the rest of it. So, although I know that I don't want to criticise governments, I know they do a lot of good work as well. They are somewhat joined up now, but I think they could be better. Now, I think you asked, what else are we doing? And I think, the sort of third point there is probably, so yes, government needs to be better at planning and your policy and regulatory environment and comms. But I think also, to my mind, it's probably also important to fund charging infrastructure where it is unfundable, privately, right? So, and give support there, make that relevant market interventions. So, if we look at something like the Rapid Charging Fund from 5 years ago, that was £900 million fund designed to target areas of poor grid connection and pay for that grid connection. Obviously, we all know the Rapid Charging Fund has been somewhat slower than expected, it would be fair to say. Yeah, I think it's really important that we also understand that sometimes the private sector, despite the £6 billion of investment that's been committed and all the rest, is still going to find areas where it's going to be difficult to invest, and government may need to intervene. So yeah, to summarise my very long answer to you, we need a positive policy and regulatory environment, market intervention where it's most needed, and also a good way of communicating the benefits of EVs and also the amazing charging infrastructure that we've already got in place.
So one thing we need to do is to get people into EVs. We used to have places like the EV Experience Centre in Milton Keynes where you could take a car for a weekend at a nominal cost. They had knowledgeable people such as previous podcast guest Dan McLaren, who worked there and who's now with BP Pulse. Sadly, this has closed. There are not quite as many ways of getting people into cars now without the pressure of a salesman. Here is Sarah Sloman's thoughts.
As we know ourselves, Gary, going EV is better when it's easy to do and affordable and attractive. Then it becomes normal for you once you get used to it. So things like making sure people have an opportunity to try EVs, that they're supported at the garages where they go to talk about those electric vehicles before they buy them, and maybe just making it a little more cost effective. We're kind of done with grants, I know that, but actually it did really help me to go EV when I knew I could get some money off, made it a bit less risky. So I think fiscal stimulus is one thing, but information and awareness raising is really powerful when deployed in the right way. Let's keep our fingers crossed.
Now, both Jack and Sarah made reference to incentives there, and this plays into the whole area of understanding how much it actually costs to buy and run an electric vehicle. We know that cars are approaching price parity in the initial purchase market. We also know that they are at price parity in the second-hand market. But what else could be done to help? Here's Patrick Dunn from Sainsbury's Smart Charge organisation.
Well, the first thing I think is, I use the word strongly, give confidence to the British public, clarity and confidence that they are committed to a zero emissions, society going forward, and the EV, the ban on petrol diesel, that will give people confidence to convert to EV. So that's the first thing, because I think the lack of confidence when the previous Prime Minister, backtracked in, you could see it in the EV sales of December, January, February, and so forth. More granular, I think the government, the VAT challenge between public and domestic charging is at 20% for public charging and 5% for domestic. When we talk about pricing, it was remiss of me, I didn't want to go political before, but it was remiss of me to talk about that gap that is purely a tax. By removing it, as early adopters, I think it'll help people realize that public charging is not only now more accessible, it's actually becoming more affordable. And that again will give confidence to the consumer to convert to an EV. I think the third thing, which is a little tongue-in-cheek, is help people get into an EV, because once they drive one, they'll realize just how pleasant it is. And so I don't know how you would go about that as a government, but incentivize people to get in and try, and you just might surprise yourself how amazing it is.
So let's bring Matt in to talk about government incentives and VAT.
Yeah, I mean, the VAT relief is, obviously one that's been talked about by industry for a while. And I think, there's certainly a way of doing it, but I think what we've probably not worked out amongst ourselves in the industry yet is how we would fund it. So, I mean, I know there are some industry estimates that say it will only cost, I think, less than 100 million or 40 million or something like that. If you look at, I think, Faircharge's website, they'll give the exact figure. But I believe certainly VAT is an interesting idea, but we do need to work out how we're going to fund it. One way that we could fund it is by increasing fuel duty, right? So that was actually an idea that some of the manufacturers are also quite supportive of, as well, as increasing fuel duty, because maybe we can fund VAT exemptions, but we could also fund some demand side interventions to make it easier to hit the ZEV mandate targets. So I think that'd be quite interesting, and whether that is a direct grant or whether that's something like a scrappage scheme could also be quite effective. I think one of the key missions of any government over the next 20-30 years is going to have to be decarbonisation of the UK and hitting net zero. And one of the key ways to do that is to decarbonise transport, which makes up about 22% of our emissions. So actually, something like a targeted scrappage scheme that is tiered based on emissions might be quite an interesting way of achieving that. I think really there's a really good opportunity to target it based off pollution. And I think, looking at it, I think there are over 390,000 cars scrapped in those sort of 2-3 year period before the sort of £400 million cap was reached. And I think we'd make far more from increasing fuel duty than 400 million. So actually, it's probably not unreasonable to expect either something like a scrappage scheme if we were to increase fuel duty in future, or a direct grant. Either would work for us, but we prefer to look at it from a pollution angle, and so a scrappage scheme that's tiered might be a more favourable way of government hitting a few of their objectives in one go, so reducing pollution but also accelerating EV rollout. So that could be quite an interesting demand side lever.
Now, I want to finish with what Adrian Fielding-Gray from BEV told me back at the start of the season. He said the following:
listening. I think they really should be talking to the people that know the industry, be that CBOs, be that industry bodies, road partners, people like yourself as well. People that really understand it. That's what they should be doing. They shouldn't be doing it. They shouldn't be thinking about what's going to point score or anything like that. Actually, they should be going out, maybe even just like grabbing some of us and say, look, can we all do a 2-week lock-in and actually just really thrash out what are the policies that are gonna make the difference? Because we've all got our opinions, for sure. We've always going to have some vested interest as well. But fundamentally, I genuinely believe that I'm speaking for myself, and I know I'm speaking for lots of others in the industry. I genuinely want to make a difference here. I want to do what's best for the country, the planet, the customer, and therefore, I'm happy to say and contribute to that in a non-biased way in order to just really help set long-term plans, the correct policies that will make the difference. And ultimately, it's about just making that transition to EV simple, communicating it clearly, and making sure using the right levers at the right places, because it's not about the public sector don't have to do everything here. There are plenty of private sector companies like ourselves that we could do our part, and the private sector does their part, and working together, we'll get there. But it's about working together, and it's about listening.
I think that's vitally important too. It's very easy for companies to try and do their own thing without looking at the bigger picture. It reminds me of something that I heard at a conference in early November. The conference was focused on charging infrastructure, and the speaker was addressing the charge point operators and many of the other companies working in that space. He said, "You are not in competition with each other at the moment. The market is so big, and there are so few of you in the big scheme that you're not in danger of cannibalizing business from each other yet." That's an important thing to remember. When Adrian talks about a 2-week lock-in to thrash out the policies, he's talking about what can happen if the whole of the industry sits with the government and works together towards a common goal. It can be discussions about how that goal is achieved, but alignment on what the goal is at this point is more important. And once people start to get into competition with each other, it becomes less easy to do things like that. Look at the phone network companies. They've consolidated down and down until there's a small handful, And now they're in a race to the bottom to attract and keep customers with thinner and thinner margins. I mean, I can't remember the last time I actually paid for a call or a text on my plan. Can you? I mean, it's all inclusive now, isn't it? Anyway, what did Matt say?
I think, certainly I think we can sort of tell already there's a slightly different approach from this government to previous governments. So whereas before something like the Rapid Charging Fund was announced without any research or knowledge about it at all, or maybe less preparation than one might expect. This government is taking a lot longer over decision making from what we can tell so far. At the end of this year, I was sort of presenting to our members on what policies or what policy consultation responses we're awaiting, and I think there was 7 of them, and they hadn't changed since last year. So I think this government have probably taken their time, and they're also trying to get their feet under the table a bit and work out exactly what they want to do in the EV space. So I think it would be fair to say that they are listening, because obviously we've had these industry roundtables recently, and there's now an onus not just on the infrastructure deployment, but also the communications around that. We were a part of a communications roundtable, which I think I mentioned earlier. So I think this government are probably being more considered in their approach, but I don't think that'll be a bad thing in the long run, long as it doesn't jeopardize either investment certainty in the short term, or indeed the ability to roll out charging infrastructure as quickly as possible. So that's a very, very fine line. But I hope that, going forwards, this government will start delivering on some of its manifesto commitments, which, ultimately were to accelerate charge point rollout, but also to introduce things like battery health certificates, among other things. So hopefully we'll start seeing this government get into action next year. But it'd be fair to say, with some of the political changes that have happened over the last couple of weeks as well, that probably hasn't helped in terms of seeing the Transport Secretary resign and a new one being implemented. But also we're seeing that actually, with the ZEV mandate, you mentioned Jonathan Reynolds as leading on that, which last time round when we had the ZEV mandate consultation originally, it was the Transport Secretary. So I think, again, that sort of shows that government have been listening, and a lot of the concerns that have been brought forward are actually around financial arguments rather than environmental or transport arguments. So I don't think that's a bad thing, and hopefully we'll see this government use that flexibility to actually move things forward a bit quicker as well.
One thing that has arisen since I did a lot of the interviews is the whole discussion of the ZEV mandate, the zero emission vehicle mandate. As a reminder, the ZEV mandate is a set of legally binding targets in terms of zero or low emission vehicles that manufacturers selling into the UK market have to meet every year between now and 2030. It's a sliding scale starting at around 20-22% this year and rising. Now, recently we had a big meeting between the OEMs and industry to discuss the ZEV mandate. They're not particularly happy about it. But I have it on good authority from someone at that meeting that it was amiable and well-intentioned, very little rancour and ill will. But since then, the Secretary of State, Andrew Reynolds, we've already mentioned, has ordered a rapid consultation into the ZEV mandate. Matt, what do you think are the possible outcomes from this review?
So I think, what the consultations can be looking at is probably about threefold, really. You've got, first of all, the sort of thing we all knew was going to happen, i.e. the government, Labour had committed to moving the end of sale of ICE vehicles back to 2030 rather than 2035. So that'll certainly be probably front and centre of the consultation, I imagine, as one of the government's key manifesto commitments. But then I think, it's been very clear from the roundtables the government have had over the last couple of weeks with manufacturers and the charging industry that, it potentially on the cards will be things around increasing the flexibilities in the ZEV mandate. So, things like the banking and borrowing mechanisms, but also the CO2 trading mechanism, which essentially allows manufacturers who are producing less CO2 from their ICE vehicles to be able to get credits. And every year we know that most manufacturers make a sort of efficiency savings of 1 or 2%. So we expect most manufacturers to be quite well equipped to use those mechanisms. And we did some quick maths, and we worked out that I think this year, manufacturers are in theory able to exploit up to 140% if they maximize, I think it's the borrowing and CO2 trading mechanism. So in theory, they could produce less vehicles than the year before and still be compliant, although that would be very, very expensive. So I imagine almost none would ever do that. But So that's certainly going to be on the table. Maybe around that is not just improving the flexibilities, but extending them to beyond the 3-year period that is currently legislated for. So 2024 to 25 and 26 may also go up to 27, 28, possibly. It's not something we'd be pushing for, but it's certainly something we know that some of the manufacturers around the table over the last few weeks have been pushing for and have publicly said as well. And then I suppose the last bit of that is the sales targets. So as you know, it's 22% this year, rising to I think 28% the next year. And I think maybe next year's sales target might be looked at and gone, should we reduce that to 26% or something like that? Or and there might be a more general question on what do you think of the sales targets? Are they achievable in the short term? And I think for us the danger in moving things like the sales targets is you make that curve a lot steeper as you continue. And so, that puts more questions on the future. But that's what we expect will probably be in the consultation. We expect that fast track consultation to be out. We originally expected to be out in October, then November, and then December. But we expect it to be out in the next couple of weeks. And we expect it to be a kind of 4 to 6 week consultation. So hopefully it'll take us to the end of January.
Those are the big themes that our guests discussed and what the government should be doing. Do you agree with them? Do you think there's anything that they've missed out? I'm sure you do. Well, let me know. This season, we're looking at raising the awareness of carbon literacy with our listeners. And one way we're doing that is with the Carbon Fact as read by carbon literacy trainer Hans Nelson.
So many natural solutions are far better than man-made. Hemp, for instance, is used to manufacture cars. It's light, biodegradable, and 10 times stronger than steel. Not to mention that it reduces carbon dioxide while it grows. Makes me wonder why we ever use plastic and fiberglass instead.
It's time for a cool EV or renewable thing to share with your listeners. Now, we don't do religion on this show, but we do EVs. So when we discovered that Pope Francis has been presented with the first all-electric Pope-mobile from Mercedes-Benz, we were interested. This innovative vehicle is a commitment to sustainable travel for the Vatican, while continuing the long-standing tradition of Mercedes-Benz vehicles serving the papacy the past 94 years. The vehicle fulfills high requirements and it was developed in close cooperation with the Vatican, specifically for the Pope's use. Its electric drivetrain was adapted to the particularly low speeds required for public appearances, and the bodywork has had extensive modifications to fit the needs of the Pope as he rides through the crowds. Check out the photos. There's a link in the show notes. A word from our sponsors Zapmap about Zap Pay, your simple and convenient way to pay for EV charging. With Zap Pay, EV drivers can easily pay for charging across multiple networks, all within the Zapmap app. No need for juggling multiple apps or accounts. Zap Pay simplifies the entire process by enabling seamless payments across a wide range of networks. With Zap Pay, you'll not only streamline your payments, but you'll also get access to a range of other features. Track your charging history at any time, receive live status updates while your car is charging, easily download VAT receipts for your records, and, as an added bonus, Zapmap Premium customers get charging discounts when paying with Zap Pay. It's incredibly easy to start. After installing the app, simply add a payment card or use Apple Pay or Google Pay, and you're ready to go. Try Zap Pay today and experience hassle-free EV charging. I hope you enjoyed listening to today's show. It was put together this week with the help of all my guests this season and Matt Adams from the REA. If you want to hear more from Matt, he did a great podcast episode with the EV Cafe, which I'll link in the show notes. If you have any thoughts, comments, criticisms, or other general messages to pass on to me, I can be reached at info@evmusings.com. On the socials, I'm on Twitter or X at MusingsEV. I'm also on Instagram at EVMusings, where I post short videos and podcast extracts regularly. Why not follow me there? Thanks to everyone who supports me through Patreon on a monthly basis and through coffee.com on an ad hoc one. If you enjoyed this episode, why not buy me a coffee? Go to coffee.com/EVmusings and you can do just that. ko-fi.com/EVmusings. Takes Apple Pay too. Regular listeners will know about my 2 ebooks, So You've Gone Electric and So You've Gone Renewable. They're 99p each or equivalent and you can get them on Amazon. Check out the links in the show notes for more information as well as a link to my regular EV Musings newsletter and associated articles. Now, I know you're probably driving or walking or jogging right now as you listen, but if you can remember and you enjoyed this episode, drop me a review in iTunes, please. It really helps me out. If you've reached this part of the podcast and are still listening, thank you. Why not let me know you've got to this point by tweeting me at MusingsEV with the words, new government, same issues. Hashtag, if you know, nothing else. Thanks as always to my co-founder, Simon. You know, he was approached by a film crew wanting him to appear in the latest Marvel adventure. He was going to be one of a group of electric unicycle riders whizzing through shot in a big fight scene, lots of lasers, explosions, unicycles, riding up walls, across roofs. I asked him if that's actually possible. And he said, no, they made a lot of it up.
I think they really should be talking to the people that know the industry.
Thanks for listening. Bye.